Hello, everyone. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish Women Entrepreneurs and Leaders podcast. And today I have the pleasure to welcome Shana. Thank you, Shana, for being with us today for this interview.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. I'm very happy for this interview because we actually met through Shafner, who recommended that we invited you for our global leadership conference, which happened last January 21st. And you were part of a panel, and I heard what you were doing, and I was like, okay, we have to have you on a separate interview to be able to dive into what you do, because the panel was a little short.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very, very welcome. So let me just first, before, if anyone doesn't know yet who is Shana, let me give you a little short bio. You'll be able to see the full bio on her website. But Shana lives with her family in Mateh Yehuda in Israel, and she is the Executive Director of Magen, which is a nonprofit based in Israel dedicated to helping victims of sexual abuse in the Jewish communities in Israel and around the world. So now you understand also why I thought that this was really an important topic that we should talk about in our podcast. Through her work in Magen, Shana advocates for legal rights of survivors of sexual abuse, raises awareness around this issue, and offers therapeutic and communal support to the victims. Shana is also a volunteer as a Jewish marital law coach and birth assistant for women with histories of sexual and physical abuse. So, Shana, this is such an important topic, and unfortunately, such a how could we say, such a big problem, right? Not only not only in our communities, but all over the world. But obviously, when we look at the Jewish communities, it touches us more directly, and it's such a specific area that needs help. And I want to start, because that's what we do in our podcast. We always start by our born to do, our mission, our calling. Why do we do what we do? And I want to start from you on a personal level. Can you tell us how you discovered that your calling was to help victims of sexual abuse? How was it on your personal journey, what you chose to do?
Sure. So I kind of fell into this work. This wasn't really what I expected to be doing. I originally started my training, my career working with at-risk youth. I thought I was going to be a therapist working with that population, and that was really something I felt very passionate about based on my own experiences and upbringing and background. And sexual abuse was always something that I was very, very aware of. But as a teenager, most of my friends had been abused, and it was something that I sort of kept noticing. This was like extremely prevalent, and it was odd that nobody was talking about it. I remember even like saying as a teenager, like, it's so weird that it's like nobody realizes that this is going on so much. And then when I started working with the population with a lot, teens who were engaged in various kind of at-risk behaviors, I just kept finding this sort of dynamic over and over again, where there was some sort of history of sexual abuse in the background, often very severe. And this kept repeating itself and over again. And then kind of gradually I started kind of narrowing in on working in that more with survivors of sexual abuse. And then found kind of my calling in working in organizations that provide advocacy and support for survivors of sexual abuse in the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities.
Right. So this is something that happens a lot, and it's spoken of not a lot, right?
Now, thankfully, it's spoken about more.
Right.
We've shined a lot of sunlight on this issue over the last 10 years or so. But definitely when I was a teenager, no one was talking about it.
Right, exactly.
Wow, it's just so strange. It's like no one's noticed that this is going on.
Right. And that's also why I was going to pick your brain a little, because I know that what we know about sexual abuse is that people don't necessarily talk about it, that it happens, but people don't necessarily complain or, file suit or, talk about it openly. And I think it's safe to say that it's especially in the ultra Orthodox communities that people don't talk about it. So there is something about something that's happening that is not spoken about. And I was wondering if you had any numbers of how many cases are we talking about? How many do you know of? Like, what is the range, or the numbers that we're talking about of people, whether it's women or children or young people that are sexually abused? Do you have any kind of, and also maybe do you know? You said that it's getting better. So do you know with numbers, like how was it 10 years ago? How is it today? Like, is there any progression in the numbers in that issue?
So first of all, I'll answer the last question first. Is it getting better question? I believe it's absolutely getting better, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's reflected in there being less abuse. It might mean that the abuse is being dealt with more quickly. It might mean that the abuse isn't progressing as far as it would have been previously because there is where to go. That can reflect in a lot of different ways. It doesn't necessarily a situation improving doesn't necessarily equal there being, certainly not in the short term. Obviously in the long term, that is a goal, but in the short term, we're talking about creating cultures of transparency where people know that this is something that they can talk about, or people know that this is something that they can get help for, that there are resources available, that they know that they understand what their rights are. Those are that's the success. And ultimately, really also in the short term, what it really might look like is the numbers going higher, because it means more people reporting, more people coming forward about their abuse. So the situation, if you just look at this based off of how much is, the cases that we hear about, it would look like the situation is much worse now than it was 20 years ago, because you never heard out about any stories of sexual abuse 20 years ago. And now you're hearing about them all the time. That's not because there wasn't sexual abuse going on 20 years ago. It's just because nobody was talking about it. They didn't think they would be believed. They may have been right, in fact. This was not something that was on the, in terms of the priorities that the media had, or that just, it wasn't something that was being focused on. It wasn't something where there were resources available. So that is the fact that the numbers, at least from the way it looks to the people looking at the situation, have gone up. That's a good sign. That's absolutely a positive thing. As far as what are the numbers, unfortunately, we don't really know that, because there's been very, very minimal research. The research that there has been, both in Israel and in other countries, very limited research that has touched on or dealt with the Orthodox community, has indicated that the numbers are somewhat similar to, at the very least, we're talking about 1 in 5 victims of abuse, meaning 1 in 5 people will be abused by the time they turn 18. Certainly in Israel and in the US, it's more or less the same. Now, obviously, we all can suspect that there might be a little more in some communities, a little less in some communities, but until there's actual research, there is no way to know that for sure. And obviously, our job is to just make sure that any survivor that is out there knows that there is where to turn, that there is help available, and that ultimately, as a community, we're creating a culture where this isn't tolerated. Victims will be supported, and abuse is not just going to be pushed under the rug or ignored, or believed that it'll just go away on its own.
Right. Well, 1 out of 5, that's a huge number. I was also expecting like some kind of not that much. That is really a huge number, meaning like out of all the people we know, 1 out of 5 has probably
Yes.
Experience that, and the work that you do is so important to hopefully reduce that number. And before we speak about how you want to reduce that number, can you tell us what is specific about the Jewish ultra-Orthodox communities that you're working with in relation to sexual abuse? Is there a specific culture? Is there something different that we could say maybe in another culture? Like, do you see that there are habits or traditions or ways that people behave that is specific to the Jewish ultra-Orthodox community in regards to sexual abuse?
Yeah, well, I mean, of course, every community has its own nuances and its own, idiosyncrasies of how it deals with things or how people look at things. And ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox Jewish communities are no different. Even within the ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox communities, we talk about it as if that's like one big, no, not at all. I mean, there are tiny little nuances between the different Hasidic sects and the different, that only people really close to those communities or in those communities understand and pick up on what those very, very sort of very fine lines are. I think that there are many aspects of the ultra-Orthodox community, specifically as it relates to sexual abuse, that are very much like many other insular communities, or I should say not unlike other insular communities. So if you look at Christian, the Catholic Church, or even if you move religion from it, but just insular communities, the kibbutzim, the way that they used to be run in a very kind of insular way, Ivy League institutions, if you look at the universities in America, you notice a lot of similar themes that kind of run through all these public scandals that really, if you will, that have come about over recent years, where it turns out the community was trying to deal with this in-house. Anytime where there's a dynamic where a community or a group wants to see some sort of line between us and them, and where there is an interest of protecting the image of the community, to others that are seeing it from outside, anytime you have that dynamic, you're going to see these similar kind of nuances of how sexual abuse is addressed. Now, with that said, there are also things that are very unique to the ultra-Orthodox community, such as, getting into the shidduch system. That's something that does exist in different cultures, but I'm saying specifically that is something that's
matchmaking. I'm just saying in English, right?
Yes.
So people
the matchmaking systems is obviously a big part of it, and we hear that often from families that are worried about dealing with their situation of sexual abuse in the family, because they're worried about how this will affect all of the children in the family, all of their.
Sorry, excuse me. You talk about the fact that it's not talked about, not the fact that it happens. You mean like it's not talked about because of the matchmaking,
right?
Because there's okay. Okay.
Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, in terms of it being addressed or how it's dealt with.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Not the fact that it happens to begin with.
Right. No. Unfortunately, that's not. I mean, right. There's also, I would say to that point, there's actually a risk. I apologize. We're in election season here. It's very loud.
Okay.
There are some things that are specific to the ultra-Orthodox and Orthodox Jewish communities that are often believed to be sort of protective factors and make it less likely that there will be sexual abuse. And these are actually very risky beliefs that can actually, I'll explain that. For example, the belief that the fact that there is a value of dressing modestly in, as part of religious practice, that is something that it protects against sexual abuse. Not only is that not true, that belief itself carries with it inherent risks, because if you believe that and if you teach that to your children, there are certain messages that you end up putting across that actually can raise their risks, such as a false sense of safety, that, I will be fine. And then the inverse of that, the flip side, is that if sexual abuse does occur, that they believe that it was because of them, that if they would have dressed more modestly, or if they would have, done something differently, then this wouldn't have happened. And that is obviously not the fact. The only thing that needs to happen for a victim to be abused by a perpetrator is for the perpetrator to gain access to that victim and to want to abuse them. It has nothing to do with what they were wearing, what they were doing, where they were going, what they were saying. And those are, in fact, manipulations that abusers use by saying, this is your fault. It was because of you. It was because of how you were dressed. Therefore, you shouldn't tell anyone because they'll understand it's your fault and you'll get in trouble. So those factors are not only not protective, but they can actually be used in a very dangerous way. They're not in themselves dangerous, but they certainly can be used that way. And that's something that people really need to be aware of. And we also need to be very careful that when we're teaching our children about values of modesty and what that means as it pertains to dress or anything, that we're not giving them any kind of subliminal or direct, certainly not direct messages that this is now your responsibility to stop abuse or to do anything. This is about your values, and it has nothing to do with anybody else, and it doesn't affect anyone else. It shouldn't affect anyone else. So those are, I think, really there are some things like that, that nuances that are really important to be aware of when working with this population. I think that that's a really important shift that we've had over the last 10 years, that there are more and more professionals from within these communities who are actually, qualified professionals. They're studying what needs to be studied, and they're training in the ways that they need to be trained. And that certainly brings a lot of value, a lot of understanding of different kind of levels of how this affects both the victims within the communities and how community dynamics are affected and play into situations of abuse. Those things are all really important.
Wow. I think it's so important what you said about the messages. If I remember correctly, unfortunately, I don't have the name of the judge, but there was a story of a woman who had been raped, and a judge who said that it was because she was wearing short skirts. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a case.
Are you talking about in Israel?
I think so. Yeah, I think
There
so.
was a very famous case it was when I was very young, I think it was in the 80s, where the judge, she was wearing white shorts. And the judge said, and this was on the front page of every newspaper, and I will share with you that
Okay.
I had a woman who shared with me once. She's a woman who's now in her late 50s, early 60s. And she shared with me that around that same time, she was sexually assaulted. She had taken a tramp and with a man, and he pulled over at the side of the road and sexually assaulted her. She managed to get out of the car before he had managed to actually rape her, but that was where it was going. And she didn't report it to the police because she said all that she just kept thinking, she just kept picturing that picture of this woman, the victim in that case, and her white shorts that had been on the cover of every newspaper. And she said, I just kept thinking, they're going to blame me because I'm wearing whatever I'm wearing. It doesn't even matter. And we know, I mean, there has been so much research that has indicated that what a woman is wearing or what a child is wearing or what a person is wearing has absolutely no bearing on whether or not they're going to be sexually abused. People are sexually abused in all kinds of states of dress, in long skirts and in tights and in long sleeve shirts and in everything. I mean, in every kind of clothing, rape can happen, sexual abuse can happen. It has nothing to do with what somebody's wearing. But that story, I remember that case, and even though I don't know how old I was at the time, very, very young, but I remember hearing about it because it really broke my heart.
Yes.
When this woman shared that with me, that she never told anyone because she was sure, because of that case, that no one would believe her and that they would blame her.
Yes, I also don't know where I remember, but I remember that when I heard about it, I was shocked. And I'm happy you're actually saying it was, a long time ago, because I didn't remember when it was. But the fact that a judge could say that it's because of the way you're dressed, that is going to be an incentive for someone to commit a sexual, a rape. I was so shocked, and that brings me to another question that I know. I mean, I'm guessing you're not only dealing with women, you're also dealing with children. Are you dealing also with men that are sexually abused? Okay, but do you see a pattern in women? Because we often speak about how women are, have low self-esteem or have low self-value. They don't really know how to value themselves or speak up. We see that also in physical violence, abuse. I mean, there are so many cases where women don't speak up. Do you see a difference between how women and men or women and children react in terms of whether they're going to complain or speak about it or be outspoken about it? Is it depending on the personality and has nothing to do with women or men?
I think that there are so many factors in terms of what you're talking about is the concept of victimology, which is very important. I always hesitate to discuss victimology in forums like this because it's something that requires so much context to understand that when you talk about victimology, you're not talking about assigning blame to the victim. They weren't abused because of this. What we're trying to do is define certain, let's say, maybe red flags that perhaps a perpetrator might look out for, certain sensitivities that they see in someone that makes them think, okay, I think I might be able to get away with it with that person. That cannot translate. And we need to be very careful not to confuse that with saying it's that person's fault, that they did something wrong. No, it's just because perpetrators are so adept at honing in on something, some sensitivity that somebody has, which they might be the strongest person in the world, but they're having a bad day. They just lost a grandparent, they lost somebody significant in their family. They're going through a hard time financially. There's something, we all have moments of vulnerability in our lives, obviously, even the strongest among us. And perpetrators are really very good at honing in on those moments and on those situations. So I think that certainly low self-esteem and not believing, not sort of for a woman or for a man, not really understanding their own self-worth is obvious. It is certainly one of those kind of risk factors. That's something that a perpetrator will look for. That's something that we know. It's also something that will often be used as part of the grooming and manipulation process, that a perpetrator will say, you're a nobody. Like, who are you? They're not going to believe you. They're going to believe me. I am so much more powerful, so much more wealthy, so much more, I have such higher standing, I have, et cetera, whatever it might be. But they will use that, whatever weakness they think they see, or they can twist the victim into believing that they're in them, they will use that. And I think that's something that's important to be aware of. Obviously, there's always good reasons to say, certainly when we're talking about raising our children, we want to raise children with a solid self-esteem, understanding their self-worth, understanding their value. And that's not, obviously, that is a factor, a protective factor against abuse, perhaps. But more than that, it also is a protective factor in, for your child to know that if something happens to them, they are worthy of getting help, and they are worthy of getting whatever resources they need. They do not have to tolerate this. They do not have to put up with it. That's a long-standing process that we go through in terms of the education that we give our kids and the messages that we bring across to them. But certainly it's a factor.
Definitely. And you spoke about power and authority, and I was wondering if, especially in the ultra-Orthodox community, you see more people, because of course the cases that we hear about in the big public are cases of teachers or rabbis, or of course the big scandals that we hear about. But do you see more a pattern of really those people that have authority position, or that are in position of power, in terms of numbers of how many cases happen, or is it the same numbers as a father in their house in like a private surroundings and not a public figure? Or do you see like there's really a pattern with public figures that are using their power to be able to perpetrate those acts?
That's a good question. I would actually further clarify that question by just pointing out that if we're talking about, there is a distinction between cases that are abuse within the family and abuse that happens outside of the family. But if we're talking about people in positions of power, parents are in a position of power. So that actually is a part of when we see those dynamics of you won't be believed, I'm more powerful than you. We see that in the parental, in the dynamics with parental abuse as well. Uncles as well, grandfathers, grandmothers, parents, even older siblings in some situations, that can play into part. We do see sexual abuse within families. Incest is a field that is now known to be much, much bigger than was previously thought. It wasn't that many years ago that I remember reading research that was, I don't know, I think also from the late 80s, where they believed that one in it was like thousands of women was sexually abused within the family. And I wish that was accurate. This is highly prevalent. At Magen, that makes up somewhere between a third and half to the cases that we deal with are abuse within the family. That's within
the family. Okay.
Yes, about somewhere above, a little bit more than a third. It's definitely a very prevalent form of abuse. I can't point to, and obviously that's just what we see in Magen. I can't point to how that reflects in terms of the wider Orthodox community in general. I can't really draw inferences from that, but that's what we see. As far as abuse with outside of the family, it is more. It's commonly somebody who's in some kind of position of authority. It's rare that there's some stranger or some guy that doesn't have some sort of ongoing relationship and some kind of power hold over the victim.
So there is a power struggle. There is something between, and I don't have the date either, but I also remember hearing that a woman being raped by her husband was not a felony until not too long ago. Meaning the husband had a right to rape. It was like it wasn't like it wasn't something. It wasn't a criminal act. It was something within the family that the police or whoever the legal system, no one would get into, because that was inside the family. Again, I don't have the exact date, but it's
unfortunately, yes, I don't have the exact date either, but that was till not that long. I mean, women weren't allowed to have credit cards until not that long ago. So there's a lot that has changed over the last 40 years. Right. But yes, and there are many countries and many places in which marital rape is still not outlawed, is still not considered a crime. I'm sorry to say I've had more conversations than I care to think about with people in my own work who are not really aware. They don't really, I mean, they may be aware of it in a very general sense. They've heard it, but they don't really understand that how serious marital rape is. Like, it's just sort of, they see it as something that happens, and it's, obviously it's not good, but it's not like a huge crime. It's not the same as rape of a, outside of marriage. Was a rape in marriage is just, it's rape. It's still
right. Exactly.
There are many people. I think that's something that's still not fully understood. It's somewhere in the yes, there are still some really distorted views about that in the consciousness or some consciousness of people among us.
Right. It's something that is still among us. Now, I would like to talk. Unfortunately, we're going from sad topics to even worse, but we have to address that. October 7th. We all heard, at least, everyone who is at least a little bit connected to reality heard what happened to women, to Israeli women, sexual crimes perpetrated by Hamas terrorists. And we're not going to say it enough. And we're not going to talk about how all the women's organization haven't criticized this and haven't really declared, how bad it is. But I want to talk about how has it changed your work inside Magen with what happened on October 7th, not only for the direct act that happened, but also as a ripple effect on everyone else in the Israeli society. Because we've heard and we've spoken of traumas that have been awakened because of all that. So I wanted to hear from you, like, what did you feel since October 7th? How is that impacting your work?
So in the immediate, in the time immediately after, even on October 7th, there were a lot of thoughts. Well, there was a lot of shock and horror, obviously for me personally as well. And it was hard to think about anything in those moments. But, very early on, there was a real awareness, I think, with all the Magen staff of this is going to be catastrophic, even before we knew how catastrophic and horrific the sexual crimes on October 7th had been. But just we know from just massive amounts of research around the world that during times of conflict, especially during times like war, the rates of sexual violence, rates of gender-based violence go up significantly. The most vulnerable populations are generally the first to suffer the most. And there's a lot of concern about what's going to happen now. Obviously, once we started hearing and becoming aware of the atrocities that happened on October 7th, along with the utter really shock and horror, because there's really no other word to describe that. There aren't any words to describe the feelings of hearing and finding out what the depravity of what happened on that day. There was a lot of concern for all of us at Magen about, the importance of reaching out to the survivors that we had been supporting prior to October 7th, because there's very much, I can share that our hotline in the immediate days when nobody was calling. And every time we called, we were initiating the phone calls with survivors, and they were so thankful that we were calling them, and they were in such difficult shape. Really, really had shape emotionally. And this was unbelievably triggering to every single one of them. And to the point where so many of them were not even functioning, but they weren't going to call for help, because there is a sense in time of such high crisis that we need to leave the resources for the people that need it most. And there are other people that went through something worse than me. So I need to not call because they have it worse than me. And obviously, resilience doesn't work like that. Resilience is the opposite. Resilience is it's like a flame. The more you share it, it doesn't distinguish it. So obviously individual resources might be limited, but when it comes to resiliency as a community, that's something we have to look at as something that when we strengthen ourselves and we give ourselves the emotional resources to move on, then we can really support others. And we should support others, because we're going to really need so much community moving forward from this. The mental health system in this country is not equipped for what we need, for what this country needs right now, and certainly what we're going to need in the coming months as things continue to sink in, and as it was in bad shape before, and it's it will collapse if we don't also really lean heavily on our own resources, and on just looking out for each other on a level of just even neighbors, as organizations, as individuals, as families, because this is something that brings up very difficult feelings for everyone. And certainly for people that had any kind of trauma previously, this is deeply triggering. We've also been doing, aside from focusing on that and some of the groups that we've run for survivors in that, who've been dealing with those triggers, we've also been doing some work with the centers for evacuees and refugees. Unfortunately, those centers and hotels are really potential hotbeds for abuse. We're talking about parents. We're talking about, first of all, a situation of chaos, people who are yanked from their home with none of their own belongings. Everything's flying. They're being run by volunteers who, God bless them, are doing the best they can, but also have very little resources and are, everything's big balagan. And then you have these volunteers who just show up and they're there to help, and no one's screening those volunteers. And that is a recipe for disaster. And we've had already multiple reports of abuse that happened within evacuee centers and with people. And of course, you have parents who are obviously deeply distracted for very good reason. They're just, they've lost their homes, they've lost their jobs potentially. Nobody knows what's going to be tomorrow. They're just trying to literally make it through the day. And this is something that, creating safety in those environments is deeply difficult, but really important.
Wow. And you started by saying that your hotline hasn't been so active, but is it
early
back?
days? Now it has,
Okay,
yeah.
Early days. Now it's back. I mean, not that it's a good thing that it's ringing, but at least, I'm guessing when it's not ringing at all, it's not a good thing.
It's not good. It means that people are in a sort of a survival mode, and they're not reaching out for help. They're just trying to live. I mean, these were the early days when when no one in the entire country was really confident that a terrorist wasn't going to come bursting through their door. People weren't calling hotlines. They weren't. They were barricading themselves in their houses and just making sure that everyone, that their loved ones were alive. That was it's the bare minimum of the hierarchy of needs. First is survival, just physical survival. And everyone was obviously very preoccupied with that.
And now you're seeing that not only the ones that were already traumatized before October 7th are triggered, but you're seeing a rise in cases because of this whole chaos and this whole situation. And you're saying that the mental health system in Israel, needs support. So you said something very interesting. You said we need to rely also on communities. We need to rely on ourselves. Being aware, being alert, looking out. So I want to end this interview, which is fascinating, unfortunately very sad, but so important to raise the awareness. And I'm, so grateful that you're doing this job. I think it's so important. But I want to end with a question on how can we, women, identify or even guess when a teenager, I'm not going to say a child because that's with the parents probably, but a teenager or a young woman or a friend that we have, what are the symptoms? What are the signs that we can identify of someone that has been abused and is, maybe not comfortable talking about it? What can we do? You said community, you said support. Like, what if I'm talking about myself, what can I do to be more alert, more aware, maybe talking to someone and hearing something and saying, first of all, I can say, hey, here's the hotline of Magen, just call them, they're professionals. But what are the signs that we can identify? Because I personally know of a few friends who have confided in me that they were sexually abused, when they were younger, and I would never have guessed. So are there any signs or is it something that you can only wait for the person to share? Like, what can we do?
So that's a great question. It's a question that usually, like, we have a workshop that we do for parents on this topic of red flags, and that's like 2.5 hours long just on that topic. So we won't be able to cover all of that now. There are certainly red flags, both for children as well as for teens. But the biggest, if I have to sum it up and really in a sentence, it's noticing, having a finger on the pulse if something changes, when behavior changes, when mood changes, when there's an indication that something is going on and something's bothering them. Now that might not be sexual abuse, especially right now. It could be many things. But it's always important to just keep a finger on the pulse and check in. And really, even before that, though, it's creating an environment where your children, all children, the people know that there are safe addresses, that we are a community that will believe victims, that we are a community that will help victims, guide victims to the right resources. That doesn't mean you as an individual need to have all the answers all the time, not at all. There's something very powerful about saying, I don't know, but I will find out. That's a statement I'm a big fan of. Or I don't know, but I will find out who does.
Right.
Connect people with the right places. And I think we need to do a lot of that now, a lot of checking in, a lot of genuine, not just about sexual abuse, but about mental health in general. How are people doing? How are the people in my circle doing? And just all checking in on each other, because it's really necessary.
Checking on each other, definitely. And I will end. I know I said that I would end before, but I have one more question because it just came to my mind. Of course, we're talking about the war now. We're talking about what happens now. But I also know that some people wake up like 10 or 20 years after the sexual abuse happened. And it happens sometimes that people, maybe they're stronger, they can deal with it, they can talk about it. And what do you advise in those cases? There's nothing, they can, file a complaint and go to the police and do, but for the victim themselves, is that helpful to actually do something about it, or to just say, well, it happened 20 years ago, let's not make a big deal out of it? Like, what is the pros and cons for that?
I think that in general, it's I'm on the one hand, I would say I'm a very big believer in victim-led processes, meaning the victim has to do what is right for them. With that said, though, I don't know if I've ever met a victim that just pretending it never happened worked for. Usually there's a need for some sort of closure. Now, that closure might be sharing it with a friend who says, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I believe you. And, I'm glad that you trusted me. That is a certain level of closure, of just, especially if the victim lived with that for all these years, the belief that they wouldn't be believed. So now being believed, that might be enough for that person. I am obviously a big proponent of therapy. I think therapy is important in general, but certainly for, working through this kind of trauma. And law enforcement can be, most of the victims that reach out to us were abused a while ago. It's not as common. We do thankfully have more and more parents who reach out about their child who was just recently abused. That's great. Obviously, the sooner the better. Right. The sooner you find out about it, the better. And the quicker there can be intervention, dealing with it and stopping it, obviously separating the victim from being, from having access to them. But when it comes to older teens, adults, statute of limitations does go on for a number of years. We have a lot of victims that reach out in their 30s that do end up going to the police, that find a lot of validation and closure, both in having the opportunity to face their perpetrator and have that, that piece of it. And also the knowledge that they're doing what they can to protect the community and protect others from being abused. That also can be significant. But again, obviously this is very individual, and the victim has to feel safe. The victim has to feel that they're going to be supported in order to start any process.
Obviously. Wow. You're right. We need more time. This is really a short time, but thank you so much. First of all, for the work you're doing. It's amazing that you're doing this work, and thank you for your time on this interview. I'm hoping that this will raise awareness, and of course, we will share your hotline number if anyone knows of, or even has doubts or seen red flags, like you said, to be in touch with you. And yeah, I really hope that this will help our community also be more responsible and aware for those issues. Thank you so much, Shana.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. And we will see you in the next episode of the Jewish Women Entrepreneurs and Leaders podcast. Thank you, everyone.